Gangs of men wearing billowing dresses threatened late-night pedestrians across the American South in the late 1800s, a precursor to the nefarious gown men of later decades. Today on American Strangeness, the strange menace of the hugging Mollies. Before the Gown Man, whose menace we explored in the first part of this series, there were the hugging Mollies. Their reign of terror lasted for over a decade in Macon, Georgia, and ultimately spread outward. Macon, Georgia is worried by a class of criminals new to this climate, stated a February 1875 news report. These mysterious men in women's apparel were said to halt people on the street during late-night hours. When an unsuspecting pedestrian stopped to see what the supposed woman needed, they would be seized and robbed of all their valuables. Several of the hugging Mollies were eventually caught and severely punished by Macon authorities, ending the trouble. But on the night of July 13, 1883, a Collinsville man named Holliday attempted to revive the old order, per the Macon Telegraph and Messenger. Holliday dressed in female attire and prowled the highway, where he jumped upon a woman, Nancy Boone, and quote-unquote abused her outrageously. Boone, a well-known woman who sold roots, herbs, barks, etc., recognized Holliday's voice and reported him to the police. This hugging Molly was arrested and fined $10, but defaulted on payment and was sent to the chain gang. Yet another hugging Molly surfaced in Macon during August 1885, assaulting people near a synagogue. He was seen loitering near the gate of a house on Pine Street, near 2nd, on the night of August 13th. The homeowner came out and attacked the hugging Molly, who fled. Police assumed it was the same perpetrator who had attempted to burglarize a house a few nights earlier and escaped when the resident discovered him. On September 1st, Macon bailiff W. Henderson sold off a trunk belonging to one of the city's hugging Mollies for $15. The buyer, C. Perryman, opened the trunk to find it contained, quote, a quantity of fine underclothing, probably stolen from one of the hugging Molly's numerous victims. On the night of September 2nd, one of the hugging Mollies grabbed a woman at the Hawkinsville Depot in Georgia, about 40 straight miles southeast of Macon. The woman struggled to escape and a scuffle ensued, during which the hugging Molly bit off the victim's left forefinger. A rare female hugging Molly named Josephine Slater was arrested by Macon police for various robberies and sent to a chain gang. Georgia indeed sentenced female prisoners to hard labor in the late 1800s. On November 20th, 1885, Slater was reported to have been transported to a hospital as she was dangerously ill with consumption and had little prospect for recovery. Black residents in the western part of Macon were said to be extremely cautious of a new hugging Molly seen on Ross Street between Hawthorne and Oglethorpe in March 1888. This masquerader was said, uniquely, to carry with him a small child as he walked and hid throughout the neighborhood each night starting at 8 p.m. The Macon Telegraph wrote that residents were still on edge about the hugging Mollies who had menaced the area in past years. Much like the Gown Man, the hugging Mollies and their victims were said to be primarily African American. They were reported throughout the southern United States following their long tenure in Macon. A gang of hugging Mollies invaded Columbia, South Carolina in July 1884, generating wild reports of men in women's clothing suddenly seizing pedestrians on the back streets at night and relieving them of their valuables. One of the victims was a penitentiary employee who on July 23rd was captured by 4 of the night prowlers in the pines north of his workplace. The quartet of highwaymen detained the man as a prisoner for several hours and stole his gold watch and chain. Meanwhile, a group of boys armed with guns, baseball bats, sticks, and stones paraded through half the city's back streets in search of the hugging Mollies, who they alleged had attacked 2 of their peers the previous night. Authorities dispersed the mob. 4 or 5 of the hugging Mollies were eventually arrested, according to the Atlanta Constitution. The hugging Mollies emerged in another Columbus, the city in Georgia, in September 1885. A Georgia newspaper defined a hugging Molly as, quote, a female who inhabits the back alleys in cities, and when she sees a gentleman pedestrian approaching, she electrifies him by gently throwing her arms around him and relieving him of all his cash and other valuables. For several years in the early 1890s, Baton Rouge was afflicted by a strange white-robed man who was known as Hugging Molly. He would hide in the bushes on North Boulevard, waiting for a woman to walk by, then would rush out and crush the terrified lady in a passionate embrace. His intent in wearing a sheet was evidently to appear as a woman to the casual observer. Baton Rouge trembled in fear, with its black populace alarmed by the resemblance of Hugging Molly's drapery to the robes of the Ku Klux Klan. Dormant at that time, but not forgotten. Years later, the man under the sheet, whose name has been lost to time, passed away, and the old Hugging Molly disguise was discovered in his dingy one-room loft apartment. He was said to be a mentally unbalanced individual who had not committed any crimes other than his, quote, amorous squeezings. George Apostle and Charles Gordon, two widely known white boys, quote, appeared in Pensacola, Florida police court on September 16, 1901. The young men pled guilty to masquerading as Hugging Mollies in female attire to scare some other boys. They were each sentenced to 30 days in the city jail and were given a lecture by the mayor. The boys had been captured by Charles Johnson and City Clerk Jones near the Christ Church after a long-distance chase. Mr. Johnson said Mr. Jones was about frightened to death, while the latter says the same thing of Mr. Johnson, wrote the Pensacola News. Another Hugging Molly, this one an African-American man with a passion for embracing passing women, appeared in Pensacola around the turn of the year from 1907 to 1908. He spread fear throughout the city until the hugging fiend finally came across a woman he couldn't intimidate. She was a trained nurse well known in Pensacola as Sister Nellie, and she was hurrying to the bedside of one of her charges. Hugging Molly jumped out in front of Sister Nellie, only to be surprised when the nurse swung her strong right arm and administered a knockout blow. The costumed man crashed down to the pavement, stretched out and unconscious. He awoke to Sister Nellie shaking him vigorously back to his senses. Pratt City, a neighborhood in Birmingham, Alabama, was in a furor over a Hugging Molly in September 1912. The fiend was known to spring upon each unsuspecting victim from a dark corner, hugging and squeezing them strenuously. A local man was charged with carrying a concealed pistol and testified in police court that he was toting the gun to defend himself against Hugging Molly. After terrorizing nearby Ensley's African-American population with her bear-like proclivities, a black woman named Sylvester McCarter was arrested September 13th for being Hugging Molly. It is said she has been an inmate of an asylum, and there seems no doubt that she is crazy now, the Birmingham News sensitively reported. McCarter had crashed a children's birthday party at the home of Thomas Long, hosted by Ms. Sally Long in honor of her two little cousins. Then Hugging Molly came into the yard and grabbed Ms. Willie Long, a white girl, in a tight embrace. She screamed for help. 3 men pulled McCarter off of the young lady and turned the hugger over to police. She caused some trouble at the jail last night, reported the Birmingham News, several husky policemen being required to incarcerate her. The Mother Hubbard man, a personality similar to Hugging Molly, walked the streets of Alexandria, Louisiana for several weeks in August 1919. Clothed in a loose black robe, he was witnessed nightly by several people in the African-American part of town known as the Sonio Oil Mill Quarters. Although the Mother Hubbard man frightened residents, he did not commit any crimes and vanished as abruptly as he first appeared. This account, considered in aggregate with the various tales collected in this 3-part series, illustrates what seems to be a relationship between and possibly an evolution from Hugging Molly to Mother Hubbard man to Gown man. Residents of Macon, seemingly the birthplace of Hugging Molly, did not forget their fearsome fiend. By 1951, Hugging Molly had mutated into a monstrous form, somewhat reminiscent of the antagonist in Stephen King's It. Wild rumor has created in Macon a hairy monster with arms 6 feet long who stalks about at night in search of victims to cut or stab, wrote Bill Ott in the July 20th Macon Telegraph. An amazing portion of the city's population has heard fantastic descriptions of this creature, which, for some unknown reason, the more terror-stricken have named Hugging Molly. Ott might not have been aware of Macon's long-festering association with Hugging Molly. As before, the entity primarily stalked Macon's African-American community. Law enforcement officers throughout the city and county of Macon fielded wild, unfounded reports of Hugging Molly sightings. One caller described Hugging Molly as having arms, quote, clammy enough to chill and so slick they feel like an eel. Some housewives learned of Hugging Molly's exploits from their cooks and promptly determined to board up their windows to protect their families. Most of the accounts appeared to derive from the mysterious slashing of an expectant mother several days earlier, wrote Ott. The woman had been sleeping in her home when a prowler stepped through a window and stabbed her in the abdomen. A neighbor heard the woman scream and then saw a man walk down a nearby alley and wash his hands at a fire hydrant. Ott discerned that an incident near Hazel Street School, in which someone supposedly witnessed, quote, a hand reaching out of a sore, caused the legend to grow to alarming proportions. Police were called and arrived to find a large armed crowd ready to deal with the creature. While the public continued to insist that Hugging Molly prowled the streets and had cut several victims, police marveled at their gullibility. Authorities laughed at the rumors but also took serious note of their consequences. Macon's mass hysteria over Hugging Molly grew dangerous, as reported in the Macon News. On the night of July 18th, Helen Temple decided to show her sister, Catherine Glover, what she would do, quote, if Hugging Molly came to her home, and she pulled a double-barrel shotgun out of the closet, firing it twice. The charges accidentally struck and wounded Glover's daughters and Temple's nieces, 9-year-old Jeanette and 8-year-old Marilyn. While Marilyn was not seriously hurt, Jeanette was hit in the back with nearly the full load of shot. The older girl was taken to Macon Hospital in serious condition and thankfully pulled through. Temple regretted her reckless actions and cooperated with police, who said that both women had been drinking when the shooting occurred. Temple was charged with assault and attempt to murder, but pled guilty to shooting at another and was sentenced to 2 to 5 years. The Abbeville Herald in Alabama noted in 1976 that most communities have their own private local legend, which is passed down through generations, and that Abbeville is no exception. The article stated that possibly the most outstanding of several legends known today is one of several stories which are still being told about Abbeville's exclusive character called Hugging Molly, and another, or maybe the same personality, known as the Woman in Black. We are advised by a prominent citizen that both female characters were men. Now we will further explore the connection between Hugging Molly, the Woman in Black, and the Gown Man in Part 3, the concluding part of this series. The Herald shared a Woman in Black tale related by Elbert Tiller, dated back to 1922. According to Tiller, the Dark Lady first appeared on the road from Haleburg to Abbeville, then several times in town. She only came out at night, especially when it was exceedingly dark and hard for anyone to view her in detail. The Woman in Black was caught several times and always managed to escape. One night, the Lady in Black was seen entering an old grammar school near a graveyard. Police and 20 men armed with guns and lanterns surrounded the building. When they entered, ordered to either capture or shoot the stranger, she had disappeared like a ghost. Another night, the Woman in Black emerged from an old barn and stopped an elderly man named Levin who was passing by. The startled pedestrian pulled out a knife. "Levin, don't cut me," the Woman in Black pleaded. "Don't you know who I am?" Levin was shocked to realize the Woman in Black was actually an old friend, and a man on whose family farm he had worked decades earlier. While Levin didn't give up the Woman in Black's identity, Abbeville residents developed their own hypothesis. They believed he was a young man from a prominent local family who, back in the 1800s, had murdered his rival for the heart of a woman, waiting in ambush and shooting the man dead as he rode by on his buggy. The murderer fled to Texas and lived there 60 years before deciding to return home to live out the remainder of his days. He stayed in a barn on Old Columbia Road during the daytime, hidden by family, and only emerged at night wearing a long black coat that looked very much like a dress. The Herald sourced the local historical society for another tale about Hugging Molly, who was said to be about 7 feet tall and as big around as a bale of cotton and lives in a dark gully down behind the schoolhouse. Late at night, Molly would creep out of her eerie nest and sweep her skirts through the streets of Abbeville. This Hugging Molly was said not to be that worrisome, content to give her victims a mighty bear hug and scream in their ear. Meanwhile, Tiller shared a very different tale about Hugging Molly's origin, dating back to a time when Abbeville was barely settled and still surrounded by thick forest. There was a little kindergarten school about a mile from town, and the students would often stay until late afternoon. One day, as the shadows grew thick and evening approached, a little girl named Molly collected her books and headed for the door. Knowing that Molly had a long walk home through a dangerous patch of woods, the teacher offered to accompany her. Molly, wanting to appear brave, declined and set off for home. Halfway through the woods, a huge bear attacked Molly and dragged her a long way down the road. A group of men cutting firewood heard Molly's screams and ran to help her, scaring off the bear. but they looked down in horror to see that the animal had bitten off one of Molly's arms at the elbow. The men placed Molly in a buggy and raced several miles away to the nearest doctor, who was actually a horse veterinarian. He was able to save the girl's life, but couldn't do much aside from cord her stump and bandage it. He did have a golden arm and gave this to Molly as a prosthetic. Even after she recovered, Molly was ashamed of the golden arm and always held it close to her body, hugging it. Molly apparently lived to be 85 or 86 and was buried in the cemetery behind Abbeville's First Baptist Church. These old legends persist in Abbeville today, so much so that Huggin' Molly has been adopted as the city's mascot and appears on its welcome sign. There is even a 1950s-themed restaurant downtown named Huggin' Mollies. Anybody who grew up in Abbeville grew up knowing the legend of Huggin' Molly, proprietor Jimmy Rain said on the eatery's website. If your mother or dad didn't want you to be out after dark, they'd tell you Huggin' Molly would get you, and you believed it too. Rain is an Abbeville native and wealthy businessman who has taken great strides to revitalize his hometown and preserve its history. Per the restaurant's account of the legend, Rain was fascinated by the tales he heard in his youth of the 7-foot-tall, black-clad ghost sweeping her skirt along Abbeville's streets and chasing down wandering souls to forcefully hug them and scream in their ears. In Part 3, we will conclude with a deeper examination of the Gown Men, Hugging Mollies, and similar characters who spread throughout the American South during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We will also look into their possible connection to the woman in black ghost phenomenon. See you next time. Stay strange.